The cruelest civilizations do not always pull the trigger. Sometimes they simply decide no one will come for you. The escape pod fell through the gray sky without guidance, tumbling between icy clouds before striking the frozen plain with a deep metallic groan. Snow drifted over its scarred hull almost immediately, as if the planet itself intended to erase the evidence that anyone had ever arrived. Inside the cramped capsule, Lieutenant Arya Voss struggled to remain conscious. Every warning display had faded except one. Life support. 27 minutes remaining. She laughed once beneath her breath, though the sound barely escaped her lips. The Empire had promised a formal hearing. Instead, it had chosen distance over justice. Exile required no witnesses. Death required no explanation. The hatch finally released with a tired hiss, allowing a wave of freezing air to flood the tiny compartment. Wind carried sharp crystals of snow across her face as she forced herself onto the frozen ground. Endless white stretched toward distant mountains beneath a pale blue sky. No cities, no rescuevikens, no ships returning for forgotten passengers. Only silence. She wrapped her thin emergency blanket tighter around her shoulders and looked once toward the stars hidden beyond the clouds. Somewhere above them, the transport that had abandoned her was already accelerating away. She was no longer a soldier. She was no longer an officer. According to official records, she no longer existed at all. Her knees weakened after only a few steps. The cold crept steadily through her clothing, stealing warmth from her hands before reaching her arms. She lowered herself beside a weathered stone formation, hoping the rock might block a little of the relentless wind. Hours seemed to disappear inside the endless snowfall. She stopped measuring time. She simply waited. Then she heard something unexpected. Engines. Not enormous warship engines echoing across the sky, but smaller turbines moving carefully through the storm. She lifted her head with difficulty. Several compact vehicles emerged from the swirling snow, their headlights cutting long paths through the white landscape. Human vehicles. Every lesson she had ever learned returned at once. Humans were dangerous. Humans never forgot an enemy. Humans survived on worlds too harsh for ordinary species because they had adapted to hardship instead of avoiding it. If humans found her first, there would be no reason to show mercy. She lowered her eyes, too exhausted to run, even if escape had been possible. Boots crunched softly across the snow. Multiple footsteps approached, then stopped only a few feet away. No voices shouted. No weapons were raised. One pair of footsteps separated from the others before moving closer at an unhurried pace. Arya slowly looked up. A man wearing a dark, insulated command coat knelt until his eyes were level with hers. He removed one thick glove despite the bitter cold and gently placed it inside his jacket pocket before speaking. "You are safe now." His voice carried neither suspicion nor triumph. It sounded remarkably ordinary, almost as though helping strangers in frozen wastelands belonged to his daily routine. Arya stared at him without understanding. "You know what I am?" she whispered. The man nodded once. "Yes." "You know who sent me?" "Yes." She searched his face for anger and found only quiet concern. "Then why are you helping me?" Snow settled across his shoulders while he considered the question. Finally, he offered a small thermal blanket from his field pack instead of an explanation. "Because you look cold," he answered simply. Behind him, the other human soldiers remained respectfully silent. None celebrated capturing an enemy. None demanded information. One medic quietly prepared medical equipment, while another activated a portable heating unit that filled the air with gentle warmth. Arya accepted the blanket almost automatically, her trembling hands struggling to hold it. No one rushed her. No one ordered her to stand. Captain Daniel Hayes waited patiently until she managed to wrap the thick fabric around herself before offering his hand. It was not the hand of a conqueror claiming victory. It was the hand of someone inviting another person back into the world. For the first time since the Empire had condemned her, Arya felt something stronger than fear. She felt confusion. Every story she had believed about humanity began to crack beneath the quiet weight of a single act of kindness while the snow continued falling around them, covering yesterday's hatred beneath a clean blanket of white. Arya woke slowly beneath the warmth of clean blankets, convinced at first that she had already crossed into memory. The room around her was quiet except for the gentle rhythm of an air purifier and the faint hum of heating units working against the endless winter outside. Soft morning light filtered through a narrow window, revealing polished steel walls, simple wooden shelves, and a small green plant resting beside the glass. It was such an ordinary detail that it unsettled her more than any prison cell ever could. She pushed herself upright, expecting restraints around her wrists or armed guards outside the door. There were none. Her uniform had been carefully folded on a nearby chair after being cleaned. A fresh thermal shirt and insulated pants had replaced the damaged clothing she had worn on the ice. Even the cracked insignia from her former rank rested beside the folded uniform instead of being discarded. Someone had treated it with respect despite everything it represented. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Before she could answer, the door opened only halfway. A gray-haired nurse carrying a tray stepped inside with an easy smile. Steam curled from a bowl of soup beside fresh bread and a mug of hot tea. "Good morning," the woman said. "The doctor wanted you to eat while everything is still warm." Arya stared at the tray, in confusion. "You are not going to question me?" The nurse blinked, then smiled again. "Not before breakfast." She placed the meal on the small table beside the bed and quietly checked the medical monitor attached to the wall. "Captain Hayes said recovery comes first. Conversations can wait." When the nurse left, Arya remained motionless for several moments. The aroma drifting from the soup reminded her of childhood winters long before military academies had taught her to measure every stranger as either an ally or a threat. Hunger finally overcame suspicion. She lifted the spoon carefully, half expecting hidden medication or some elaborate interrogation to begin the moment she accepted the food. Nothing happened. The soup was simply warm. The bread was fresh. The tea carried the faint scent of mint. Nearly an hour later, another knock came at the door. This time, Captain Daniel Hayes entered alone, still wearing his dark command jacket dusted with melting snow. He held a small tablet in one hand and two ceramic cups in the other. "The weather is getting worse," he said casually while setting one cup on the table. "I thought you might appreciate more tea." Arya watched him carefully. "You still have not asked who I served." Daniel pulled a chair closer without sitting behind a desk or creating distance between them. "I already know who you served. Then you know I was your enemy." "Yesterday, perhaps." His answer came without hesitation. "Today you are my guest." She searched his face for mockery and found none. "You cannot possibly trust me." Daniel looked toward the snow, falling beyond the window before answering. "Trust is not something I give all at once. It grows one decision at a time. The first decision was making certain you survive the night." Silence settled comfortably between them. Outside, a snowplow moved slowly across the courtyard while several human mechanics laughed together as they repaired a transport vehicle buried beneath fresh snow. Life continued with remarkable normality. No alarm sounded because an alien officer occupied a room inside the base. No one hurried through the halls whispering about spies or revenge. Daniel finally stood and walked toward the door. "There is one thing I should tell you," he said. Arya looked up. "What?" He rested his hand on the door frame. "No one here will force you to answer questions before you're ready. Healing is easier when people are treated like people." After he left, Arya lowered her eyes toward the untouched second cup of tea he had brought for himself but never drank. He had entered expecting a conversation, yet he had walked away without demanding one. The warmth spreading through the room no longer came only from the heaters. Somewhere beneath years of fear, discipline, and betrayal, a quiet certainty began to grow. For the first time since her own people had abandoned her, she wondered whether the stories told about humanity had hidden their greatest truth instead of revealing it. Morning sunlight reflected across the frozen valley, turning every field of snow into a sea of quiet silver. Lieutenant Arya Voss stood beside the infirmary window, wearing the insulated clothing the human medical staff had prepared for her. Beyond the glass, the frontier outpost had already come alive. Maintenance crews cleared fresh snow from landing pads, while engineers inspected communication towers coated with frost. A pair of children hurried across the courtyard carrying school packs almost larger than themselves, laughing as they raced toward a small education center built beside the command building. Nothing resembled the military fortress she had expected. The base functioned like a small community where soldiers, scientists, mechanics, teachers, and families shared the same streets and greeted one another by name. A quiet knock sounded behind her. Captain Daniel Hayes stood in the doorway, holding 2 insulated jackets. "The doctor says you can walk outside if you feel strong enough," he said. "There is something I would like to show you." Arya hesitated only briefly before following him through the main corridor. People looked toward her as they passed, but none reacted with fear or anger. A young technician smiled politely and stepped aside to let them pass. An elderly maintenance worker nodded in greeting before returning to repair a heating pipe. One little boy stared curiously at the unfamiliar visitor until his mother gently took his hand and whispered something that made him wave instead of hiding behind her. Arya found herself lifting her hand in return before realizing what she had done. Daniel noticed but said nothing. They stepped outside into crisp winter air where the scent of pine trees mixed with fresh snow. The wind remained cold, yet the thick jacket kept her comfortable. Daniel led her along a path overlooking the valley until they reached a broad observation platform built into the hillside. Below them stretched a civilian settlement protected by the human outpost. Small homes surrounded a medical clinic, workshops, greenhouses, and a community center whose windows glowed warmly against the frozen landscape. Human families walked beside alien merchants and researchers representing several peaceful worlds. No one appeared separated by species. Everyone simply belonged. Arya leaned lightly against the railing. "I was told humans distrusted everyone outside their own kind." Daniel smiled faintly. "Trust takes time. Respect begins much sooner." Before she could answer, a transport landed near the settlement, carrying several travelers wrapped in heavy winter coats. Volunteers immediately approached to help unload supplies, while a group of children rushed forward to greet the newcomers with cheerful excitement. Among the passengers, Arya noticed 2 elderly aliens whose appearance resembled neither humans nor her own people. They were welcomed with warm handshakes and guided toward the community center without hesitation. "Who are they?" she asked. "Refugees," Daniel replied. "They lost their colony during a solar storm last year. They are rebuilding their lives here." Arya lowered her eyes. "You accepted them without asking which side they fought for." Daniel rested both hands on the observation rail. Sometimes survival matters more than history. They remained silent while snow drifted gently across the valley. Somewhere below, church bells rang softly at the top of the hour, blending with the distant laughter of children building snow shelters beside the schoolyard. The ordinary sounds felt strangely powerful. Arya had spent years believing strength came from fleets, ranks, and victories. Yet this quiet settlement endured because strangers chose cooperation over suspicion every single day. As they prepared to return, an emergency beacon flashed briefly atop the communications tower. The alarm lasted only a few seconds before changing to a steady amber light. Several rescue vehicles rolled calmly from their garages while trained volunteers gathered equipment with practiced efficiency. No panic spread through the base. Everyone simply moved toward their assigned responsibilities. Daniel glanced toward the tower and then back at Arya. "An avalanche blocked the northern supply road," he explained. "There are civilians stranded beyond the ridge." He started walking toward the rescue vehicles before pausing beside her. "You should stay inside where it's warm." Arya watched the rescue teams preparing to leave without carrying weapons, only medical packs, climbing gear, thermal blankets, and emergency supplies. For the first time since arriving on Earth, she found herself hoping every one of them would return safely, and the realization unsettled her far more than the cold ever could. The rescue convoy disappeared into the white horizon with remarkable discipline, its headlights fading behind curtains of blowing snow until only the distant sound of engines remained. Lieutenant Arya Voss stood beneath the shelter outside the command building, watching the last vehicle vanish beyond the ridge. Every instinct shaped by years of military service expected heavily armed escorts moving toward danger. Instead, the convoy carried rescue specialists, physicians, engineers, portable heaters, emergency shelters, and enough food to support dozens of stranded civilians for several days. Captain Daniel Hayes sat in the lead vehicle, studying weather maps rather than tactical displays. Nearly 40 minutes passed before Arya finally turned away from the frozen valley. She intended to return to the infirmary, yet her feet carried her instead toward the operations center where volunteers quietly coordinated the rescue effort. Large digital maps covered the walls, displaying snowfall, wind speed, road conditions, and the locations of isolated settlements scattered across the mountains. No one seemed surprised that she had entered the room. A communications officer offered her a chair beside a heater before returning to his console. "Would you like some coffee?" he asked politely. Arya hesitated. "I do not believe I have earned your hospitality." The young officer smiled without looking away from the incoming data. "Around here, warm drinks are not rewards. They're necessities." She accepted the steaming cup almost absent-mindedly and continued watching the room. Every person worked with calm concentration. No shouting echoed across the operations floor. No one blamed the storm or complained about the difficult conditions. They simply solved one problem after another. Several hours later, the first rescue updates appeared. One elderly couple had been safely located inside a snow-covered cabin after losing electrical power. A family traveling between settlements had reached a temporary shelter established by the convoy. A maintenance crew had restored communication with a remote weather station where 3 researchers had become stranded. Each successful report drew quiet smiles instead of celebration. Saving lives seemed less like extraordinary heroism and more like ordinary responsibility. As daylight slowly faded behind thick clouds, the main doors opened and Captain Daniel Hayes entered carrying melting snow across his boots. His jacket was covered with frost, and fine ice crystals clung to his hair, yet his expression remained composed. Several team members immediately began reviewing new information with him, while medical staff unloaded portable stretchers containing exhausted travelers wrapped in thermal blankets. Children were reunited with worried parents. An elderly man thanked every volunteer he passed. A frightened little girl clung tightly to a rescue medic until her mother embraced her. Daniel moved quietly through the room, making certain everyone had been examined before removing his own gloves. Only then did he notice Arya standing nearby. "You stayed," he said. She nodded. "I wanted to understand." Daniel poured himself a cup of coffee that had long since cooled. "Did you?" Arya looked across the busy operations center where human volunteers continued serving hot meals to strangers they had never met before that morning. "In my military academy," she said softly, "we were taught that strength meant defeating opponents before they became threats." Daniel listened without interrupting. "Today I watched your people measure strength by how many lives return home." He looked toward the families gathering near the warming station. "Every civilization chooses what it celebrates." His quiet answer lingered in her thoughts long after the room fell silent again. Later that evening, as fresh snow settled gently across the base, Arya stepped outside alone. She watched rescue vehicles parked beneath bright floodlights while mechanics inspected every engine before the next emergency arrived. No banners honored the crews. No ceremonies praised their courage. Tomorrow they would simply answer another call if someone needed help. Standing beneath the peaceful winter sky, Arya realized that humanity's greatest habit was not winning impossible battles. It was refusing to become too busy, too frightened, or too proud to stop for someone who had fallen. Somewhere deep within her heart, a belief she had carried since childhood quietly gave way to a different truth. And for the first time, she wondered whether compassion required far more courage than conquest ever could. The storm finally surrendered to a clear winter morning, leaving the valley covered beneath untouched snow that reflected the first rays of sunlight like polished crystal. Lieutenant Arya Voss wandered quietly through the human outpost while most of the base had already returned to its ordinary rhythm. Mechanics repaired rescue vehicles damaged by the previous day's mission. Medical staff restocked emergency supplies. Children crossed the courtyard toward school, carrying colorful backpacks, while greeting every adult they passed. No one behaved as though yesterday's rescue had been extraordinary. To them, it had simply been another day spent protecting neighbors. Arya found herself stopping outside a modest brick building marked historical archives. Curiosity overcame hesitation, and she stepped inside. Warm air carried the familiar scent of old books, polished wood, and fresh coffee. Rows of digital records stretched across quiet reading rooms where historians carefully preserved the stories of the settlement since its founding. An elderly archivist looked up from a terminal and smiled kindly. "You must be our newest guest," he said. "You're welcome to explore anything that is open to the public." Arya thanked him softly before walking between the displays. She expected exhibits celebrating military victories or famous commanders. Instead, she found photographs of doctors opening rural clinics, engineers rebuilding bridges after disasters, volunteers planting forests, teachers standing beside graduating students, and rescue teams embracing families after successful missions. Every display celebrated service rather than conquest. Near the back of the archive, one photograph immediately caught her attention. Captain Daniel Hayes appeared much younger, standing beside a woman with gentle eyes, while two small children smiled between them beneath bright summer sunlight. They looked completely ordinary, dressed in simple clothes during what appeared to be a neighborhood festival. Arya remained motionless before the image until the archivist quietly approached. "That picture was taken 12 years ago," he said. She looked toward him carefully. "His family?" The old man nodded. "His wife taught science at the community school. Their son loved astronomy. Their daughter wanted to become a wildlife veterinarian." Arya waited for him to continue. His warm smile faded into thoughtful silence. They were traveling to another colony when their civilian transport disappeared during the border conflict. He did not offer dramatic details or blame anyone. He simply stated the truth with quiet respect. Arya felt an unexpected heaviness settle inside her chest. She remembered the war from the opposite side. Endless reports, strategic objectives, casualty numbers displayed on cold military screens. Never once had those reports shown a smiling family standing beneath summer skies. "Does Captain Hayes hate us?" she asked almost in a whisper. The archivist looked surprised by the question. "No," he answered gently. "He misses them every day. Those are not the same thing." Arya lowered her eyes toward the photograph once more. Everything she believed about revenge suddenly felt incomplete. Later that afternoon, she found Daniel outside the maintenance hangar, helping two technicians replace damaged panels on a rescue vehicle. He worked beside them without drawing attention to his rank, laughing quietly when one of the younger mechanics accidentally covered his gloves with grease. When the repairs were finished and the others returned inside, Arya slowly approached him. "I visited the archives," she said. Daniel wiped his hands with a clean cloth and nodded. "Then you learned something about me." She struggled to find the right words. "I'm sorry for your family." He remained silent for several moments while watching snow drift gently across the runway. "Thank you," he finally replied. "That means more than you probably realize." Arya looked directly at him. "After everything that happened, why did you save me?" Daniel drew a slow breath before answering. "Because losing the people I loved taught me exactly how much every life matters." His voice carried no anger, no bitterness, only quiet certainty shaped by years of choosing compassion instead of resentment. As evening settled across the valley, Arya watched him return to his ordinary duties among the people he protected every day. For the first time since her exile began, she understood that the strongest person she had ever met was not someone who had forgotten pain. He was someone who refused to let pain decide the kind of person he would become. The first sign that something had changed arrived before sunrise. A quiet notification chimed across the command center, followed by a steady amber light on the communications wall. Lieutenant Arya Voss looked up from the observation deck as technicians exchanged brief, professional glances instead of hurried alarm. Captain Daniel Hayes accepted the incoming transmission without leaving the operations floor. A three-dimensional emblem slowly rotated above the central console. It belonged to the Valyrian Imperial Council. The room grew noticeably quieter. Several officers instinctively looked toward Arya before returning their attention to Daniel. No one blamed her. No one stepped closer as if expecting danger. They simply waited for their commander to decide how the conversation would proceed. Daniel touched the console, and the holographic image of a senior Valyrian official appeared above the table. The official's expression remained cold and disciplined. Captain Daniel Hayes, the figure began, the individual identified as Lieutenant Arya Voss remains the lawful responsibility of the Valyrian Empire. We have confirmed that she is currently inside your jurisdiction. Humanity is instructed to transfer her immediately. Daniel folded his hands behind his back. Lieutenant Voss arrived here as an abandoned survivor. She is receiving humanitarian protection. She belongs to our government. Daniel answered calmly. People are not property. The words settled across the room with remarkable weight. The official paused before continuing. Your refusal may complicate diplomatic relations. Daniel's voice never rose. Providing medical care and shelter to someone in need should never complicate diplomacy. The transmission ended without another sentence. Silence returned to the command center. Arya remained frozen where she stood. She had expected negotiations. She had expected compromise. She had expected herself to become a bargaining chip between governments. Instead, Daniel had defended her dignity before discussing politics. She approached him after the other officers returned to their stations. You did not have to do that, she said quietly. Daniel looked toward the large window where snow drifted gently across the landing field. Yes, he replied. I did. She lowered her voice. The Empire may pressure your government. Perhaps. They may threaten trade. Possibly. They may blame Earth for protecting me. Daniel finally turned toward her with the same calm expression she had seen on the frozen plain only days earlier. None of those possibilities changes what is right today. His answer left her without words. Later that afternoon, the news spread quietly through the settlement. Refugees, mechanics, teachers, and medical volunteers learned that the human commander had declined an official request to surrender a guest placed under his protection. No celebrations followed. No speeches filled the courtyard. An elderly baker simply prepared extra loaves of fresh bread for the evening meal. The school principal reminded students that every visitor deserved kindness. A maintenance crew repaired another heating system at the refugee housing complex before the temperature dropped again. Life continued with remarkable normality because compassion was not treated as an extraordinary event. It was simply part of the community's daily routine. As evening approached, Arya wandered outside and watched snowflakes settle across the quiet memorial garden beside the medical clinic. Small lights illuminated engraved names honoring people from many different worlds who had once found safety within the settlement. Human names appeared beside alien names without distinction. She slowly realized that this place measured belonging by shared humanity rather than shared biology. Daniel joined her carrying 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. He handed one to her without saying a word. They stood together beneath the softly falling snow until Arya finally broke the silence. Back home, she admitted, I believe mercy was a weakness powerful civilizations could not afford. Daniel watched the warm light glowing through the clinic windows. On Earth, he said gently, we learned something different. Mercy is often the reason powerful civilizations deserve to survive. Arya wrapped both hands around the warm mug, feeling its comforting heat against the cold evening air. For the first time since her exile began, she stopped wondering whether she would ever return to the Empire. A different question quietly formed in her heart instead. She wondered why the place where she had expected to lose everything had become the first place where someone had insisted that her life still mattered. The weather station issued its warning just after dawn. Fresh snow had begun falling across the northern mountains, and temperatures were dropping faster than expected. Inside the command center, large terrain maps slowly filled with shifting weather patterns while supply routes blinked between green and amber. Captain Daniel Hayes studied the incoming reports with a quiet concentration that had become familiar to everyone around him. There was no urgency in his movements, only careful decisions made one after another. Lieutenant Arya Voss stood beside the operations table, watching volunteers prepare thermal shelters, portable generators, medical kits, and food containers. Once again, no one loaded weapons. Their first instinct was always to preserve life. A communications officer looked up from his console. "Captain, the northern settlement has requested assistance. Heavy snow has blocked the mountain pass. Several families cannot reach the main road." Daniel nodded immediately. "Dispatch the rescue convoy." He glanced toward Arya before adding, "The western approach is becoming unstable. We will need another route." Arya looked at the digital terrain map. The mountain range stretched across the display like a frozen maze. Suddenly, she recognized a narrow valley hidden beneath the larger ridges. During her military service, she had studied that region while planning humanitarian evacuation corridors long before her government abandoned those plans. "There is another path," she said quietly. Several officers turned toward her. Arya pointed to the narrow passage. "It is longer, but the rock formations protect travelers from most avalanche zones. Supply vehicles can pass if they remain close together." One of the navigation specialists quickly entered the coordinates. Seconds later, the computer confirmed her assessment. The alternate route remained open. Daniel looked at her without hesitation. "Will you guide us?" The question caught her completely off guard. "You trust my judgment?" Daniel answered with the same calm certainty he always carried. "You have given me no reason not to." Those simple words settled deeply within her. For years, she had served commanders who demanded loyalty before offering confidence. Here, trust grew through actions instead of fear. Less than 20 minutes later, the rescue convoy rolled across the frozen valley. Arya rode beside Daniel in the lead vehicle while snow drifted steadily across the windshield. The narrow mountain trail curved between towering cliffs covered with ice, creating a silent corridor where only the sound of engines disturbed the stillness. As they continued climbing, visibility became increasingly limited. Daniel slowed the convoy rather than rushing forward. "There is no prize for arriving first," he reminded the drivers over the communication channel. "Everyone arrives together." Arya quietly watched him. Even during difficult conditions, his attention remained focused on the people behind him instead of his own position at the front. After nearly an hour, the convoy reached the isolated settlement. Several homes stood partially surrounded by snowdrifts, but warm lights still glowed through their windows. Families emerged carefully as rescue teams unloaded heating equipment, food supplies, and medical materials. Children smiled with relief when volunteers handed them warm blankets and insulated boots. An elderly woman gently squeezed Arya's hands after learning she had identified the safe route through the mountains. "Thank you for bringing them here," she said with quiet gratitude. Arya could only nod. No one asked where she had been born. No one questioned which uniform she had once worn. In that moment, the only thing that mattered was that help had arrived. As the convoy prepared to return before nightfall, Daniel paused beside the observation point overlooking the valley. Snowflakes drifted gently through the fading afternoon light while the settlement slowly disappeared behind curtains of white. "You saved valuable time today," he said. Arya lowered her eyes. "I only shared what I knew." Daniel smiled softly. Sometimes that is exactly how people save one another. During the quiet drive back to the outpost, Arya stared through the window at the endless mountains passing beneath the evening sky. She realized something had changed inside her without any dramatic speech or extraordinary event. Days earlier, she had believed she was an unwanted exile with no place left in the galaxy. Now, for the first time since her world had abandoned her, someone had trusted her enough to place other lives in her hands, and she silently promised herself that she would never betray that trust. Snow continued falling through the night, covering every rooftop with a fresh layer of white until the entire frontier settlement seemed wrapped in quiet light. Lieutenant Arya Voss stood alone outside the command building just before sunrise, watching the first volunteers begin another ordinary day. Bakers carried warm bread toward the community kitchen. Mechanics inspected rescue transports before anyone requested assistance. Teachers welcomed children into classrooms where laughter drifted softly into the frozen air. The peaceful routine felt almost impossible to reconcile with the stories she had grown up believing about humanity. A gentle tone echoed from the communications tower, followed by a request for all senior officers to report to the operations center. Daniel Hayes entered moments later, still wearing the same calm expression that never seemed to change no matter what message arrived. Arya followed quietly, unsure whether she belonged inside the briefing room. Daniel noticed her hesitation and simply opened the door wider. "You are welcome here," he said. Inside, a secure transmission from the Galactic Council illuminated the central display. Representatives from several member civilizations appeared together, their expressions serious but controlled. One senior diplomat spoke first. "Captain Hayes, additional records concerning Lieutenant Arya Voss have been declassified. They should have been released before her sentence was carried out." A series of official documents appeared across the holographic screen. Arya immediately recognized the military seal of the Valyrian Empire. Her breathing slowed as she read the first lines. Years earlier, she had commanded an evacuation mission assigned to remove civilians from a colony threatened by conflict. During the operation, she had received a direct order instructing her to abandon thousands of non-combatants so military assets could withdraw more quickly. She had refused. Instead of obeying, she had continued organizing rescue transports until every civilian able to travel had reached safety. The mission succeeded, but her refusal to follow orders had embarrassed powerful officials who later rewrote the official record. Rather than recognizing her actions, they accused her of insubordination and quietly arranged her exile. The briefing room remained silent after the final document disappeared. No one looked at Arya with suspicion. No one questioned the authenticity of the evidence. Daniel studied the files before turning toward her. "You chose people over your career," he said softly. Arya lowered her eyes. "At the time, I believe I'd failed everyone. I lost my rank, my home, my future." Daniel shook his head gently. "You protected lives. That is not failure." One of the council representatives cleared her throat before speaking again. "Captain Hayes, the council acknowledges that Lieutenant Voss was wrongfully condemned. A formal review has begun." The transmission ended, leaving the room wrapped in thoughtful silence. Arya remained motionless. She had imagined many endings to her story, but not this one. The truth she had carried alone for so many years no longer belonged only to her. Later that afternoon, she walked through the settlement with Daniel. Children played in the snow beside the school, while families decorated the central square for the approaching winter festival. Music drifted gently from the community hall, where volunteers prepared a shared evening meal. Daniel stopped beside a memorial tree whose branches carried small ribbons honoring people who had chosen compassion during difficult times. "Do you know why this place feels different?" he asked. Arya looked around at the peaceful community. "Because no one here is judged only by their worst day." Daniel smiled quietly. "Because everyone is given the chance to become more than the label someone else placed on them." Arya reached toward one of the ribbons, moving gently in the cold breeze. For years, she had carried the title of exile, as though it defined every part of her life. Standing beneath the snow-covered branches, surrounded by people who had expected nothing from her except honesty, she realized that identity could be restored the same way trust was built. Not through speeches or ceremonies, but through countless small acts of grace repeated day after day. As evening settled across the valley and warm lights appeared inside every home, she no longer felt like someone abandoned by the galaxy. She felt like someone who had finally been seen for who she had always tried to be. The final days of winter arrived quietly, and with them came a sky so clear that every star above the frontier settlement seemed close enough to touch. Lieutenant Arya Voss stood beside the landing field before sunrise, watching a sleek diplomatic shuttle descend through the pale morning light. Its silver hull carried the official insignia of the Galactic Council, and for the first time in many years, it had come for her without chains, accusations, or hidden intentions. Captain Daniel Hayes joined her a few moments later, his hands tucked inside the pockets of his insulated coat as the cold breeze carried fresh snow across the empty runway. Neither of them spoke while the shuttle settled gently onto the landing pad. The boarding ramp lowered, and two council representatives stepped forward with calm expressions. One of them held a small ceremonial case containing newly issued documents. Lieutenant Arya Voss, the senior representative, said respectfully, "The council has completed its investigation. Your conviction has been overturned. Your military record has been fully restored. You are free to return home with every honor that was wrongfully taken from you." The words echoed softly across the quiet landing field. Months earlier, Arya would have imagined this moment countless times. She had believed that hearing those sentences would erase every wound left by exile. Instead, she felt only gratitude that the truth had finally been acknowledged. She accepted the official documents with both hands and thanked the representatives sincerely. They waited patiently beside the shuttle while giving her all the time she needed. Daniel remained several steps behind, making no attempt to influence her decision. He had never tried to control her future. He had simply protected her long enough for her to choose it herself. Arya slowly turned toward the familiar settlement stretching across the snowy valley. Children hurried toward school carrying bright winter scarves. Mechanics laughed while repairing another rescue vehicle. Volunteers stacked food supplies near the community center in preparation for the next storm. The same ordinary kindness that had welcomed her on the first day continued without expecting recognition. She looked back at the shuttle, then at Daniel. "If I leave," she asked softly, "will this place continue exactly as it is today?" Daniel smiled gently. "Tomorrow someone else will need help. We will be here." She nodded, understanding at last why this settlement felt different from every place she had ever served. It did not depend on one remarkable person. It depended on thousands of ordinary people choosing compassion every single day. Arya closed the ceremonial case and walked toward the shuttle. She stopped at the bottom of the boarding ramp and looked up at the open doorway waiting for her. Beyond it lay the life she had lost, her restored career, and a chance to reclaim the world that had once abandoned her. She stood there for a long moment before quietly turning around. The council representatives watched in respectful silence as she walked away from the shuttle instead of boarding it. She returned to where Daniel stood beneath the softly falling snow. "Are you certain?" he asked. Arya looked toward the settlement, where warm lights glowed through frosted windows and families gathered for the beginning of another ordinary day. A child waved at her from across the square. Without thinking, she waved back with an easy smile. "I was sent here with the expectation that I would disappear," she said. "Instead, I was reminded that dignity can be given back by people who owe you nothing." She looked directly at Daniel. "I do not wish to spend the rest of my life remembering where I was rejected. I would rather help protect the place where I was welcomed." Daniel offered a quiet nod, neither celebrating nor questioning her choice. He simply accepted it. The council representatives exchanged understanding glances before closing the shuttle doors. The vessel lifted gracefully into the morning sky and disappeared beyond the distant mountains, leaving only silence behind. Snowflakes drifted gently through the golden sunlight as Arya and Daniel began walking back toward the settlement together. No speeches marked the moment. No ceremony announced a new beginning. Somewhere nearby, the school bell rang, rescue vehicles prepared for another day of service, and fresh bread filled the cold air with warmth. The galaxy had believed humanity's greatest strength was the courage to stand against its enemies. Arya had discovered something far rarer. Humanity possessed the courage to kneel beside someone the entire universe had abandoned, offer an open hand without asking for anything in return, and quietly prove that sometimes the smallest act of kindness could become the place where a life truly began.